What if the scariest films ever made were ones audiences walked out of, or never showed up to see at all? Some of cinema's most terrifying masterpieces opened to empty theaters, savage reviews, and studio embarrassment. One of these films earned less than its own catering budget on opening weekend. Yet today, they sell out midnight screenings worldwide. Here are 10 horror movies that failed first, then became legends. Number 10. Freaks, 1932. There are horror films that disturb you. Then there is Freaks, a film so unsettling that it was banned in the United Kingdom for over 30 years and reportedly caused a woman to miscarry in the theater, though that story has since become part of its mythological infamy. Director Todd Browning had just come off the massive success of Dracula, and MGM gave him full creative freedom. He used real circus performers with physical differences as his cast, blurring the line between exploitation and empathy in a way Hollywood had never attempted before. Audiences in 1932 were not ready. The film bombed catastrophically, MGM was embarrassed, and Browning's career never recovered. Critics called it grotesque, irresponsible, and morally reprehensible. The studio recut the film, slashing nearly 30 minutes of footage that has never been recovered. But here is where the story flips. Decades later, Freaks found its audience through underground screenings and revival theaters. Film historians began recognizing what Browning had actually done. He humanized the outsiders and made the beautiful, physically typical characters the true monsters. That twist, radical for its era, now feels ahead of its time by a generation. The famous "One of Us" chant remains one of the most chilling moments in horror history. What was once institutional shame became a Criterion Collection crown jewel. Freaks did not just survive rejection, it outlasted almost every film from its decade. Number 9. The Wicker Man, 1973. The British distributor called it an embarrassment and buried it as a B-movie support feature. The studio reportedly destroyed original print reels. Director Robin Hardy was so furious that he spent years trying to reconstruct his own film from scattered copies. Yet The Wicker Man is now consistently ranked among the greatest British horror films ever produced, and its final scene is considered one of the most haunting conclusions in all of cinema history. The film follows a devout Christian police sergeant who travels to a remote Scottish island to investigate a missing girl, only to discover an isolated pagan community with deeply unsettling rituals. Christopher Lee, who played the charismatic and terrifying Lord Summerisle, has called it the best film he ever made, a remarkable statement from the man who portrayed Dracula dozens of times. What makes The Wicker Man extraordinary is what it refuses to do. There is no jump scare, no conventional monster, no gore. The horror builds entirely through atmosphere, folklore, and the creeping realization that the protagonist is entirely alone in his worldview. That slow, suffocating dread was considered uncommercial and confusing in 1973. Today, scholars of folk horror, an entire subgenre The Wicker Man essentially invented, point to this film as the foundation. It inspired Midsommar, The Vivitch, and dozens of other modern horror landmarks. The studio that tried to erase it now cannot escape its shadow. Number 8. Possession, 1981. When Possession screened at Cannes in 1981 and Isabella Gianni won Best Actress, the film should have launched into global celebration. Instead, it was seized by UK authorities under the Video Nasties Act, banned in multiple countries, and dismissed as unhinged art house indulgence. American distributors cut over 40 minutes from the film and repackaged it as a cheap creature feature, destroying its meaning entirely. The film quietly disappeared. Director Andrzej Sulawski had written the screenplay during his own devastating divorce, and that raw psychological collapse is embedded in every frame. The story, a woman in Berlin whose marriage collapses while she begins a mysterious relationship with something monstrous, operates on multiple levels simultaneously. It is a divorce film. It is Cold War allegory. It is a meditation on identity dissolution, and yes, it is absolutely terrifying. The scene where a Johnny has a breakdown in a subway tunnel, convulsing, screaming, and seemingly shedding her humanity on camera, is one of the most committed pieces of acting ever filmed. She reportedly suffered psychological distress during production. The footage feels less like performance and more like documentary. When Possession was finally restored and re-released in the 2000s, a new generation of horror fans discovered something unclassifiable and deeply affecting. It now regularly appears on lists of the most important horror films ever made. What censors tried to bury became exactly the kind of film that cannot be buried, one that stays with you long after the screen goes dark. Number 7. The Thing, 1982. John Carpenter released The Thing 2 weeks after E.T. The extraterrestrial hit theaters and captured the entire planet's heart. The timing was catastrophic. Audiences wanted a friendly alien. Instead, Carpenter delivered a shape-shifting creature of pure paranoia and biological nightmare that could wear the face of anyone in the room. Critics were merciless. Roger Ebert called it a geek show. Audiences stayed away in massive numbers, and the film lost Universal Pictures a significant sum. Carpenter was devastated. He has spoken openly about how the failure of The Thing effectively derailed the creative momentum of his career. The studio had little faith in him afterward, and the budget freedom he had enjoyed evaporated. What the film actually is, and what took years for audiences to recognize, is arguably the greatest paranoia horror film ever constructed. Set in an Antarctic research station where a crew of scientists cannot trust one another because any of them might have been replaced by an alien organism. The Thing captures Cold War anxiety, masculine fear, and institutional distrust in a way that feels disturbingly relevant decades later. Practical effects, created by Rob Bottin at age 22, remain jaw-dropping today. No CGI has replicated their visceral, wet, biological wrongness. Directors like Guillermo del Toro and Edgar Wright have cited The Thing as a foundational influence. It was not simply redeemed by time. It was recognized as the masterpiece it always was, just not on the studio's schedule. Number 6. Videodrome, 1983. Universal Pictures had absolutely no idea what to do with Videodrome. Their marketing materials were confused, their release strategy was half-hearted, and when audiences showed up expecting a conventional thriller and found David Cronenberg's deeply hallucinatory essay on television, the body, and reality itself, they walked out. The film grossed a fraction of its budget and disappeared from theaters within weeks. James Woods plays a cable television programmer who begins receiving mysterious transmissions that cause hallucinations, tumors, and eventually a complete dissolution of the boundary between his body and technology. A television set breathes. A VHS tape writhes. A stomach becomes a VCR slot. Cronenberg was not making metaphors loosely. He was arguing that media consumption was physically transforming the human body, a thesis that in 1983 seemed paranoid and in 2026 seems prophetic. The film coined the phrase, "Long live the new flesh," a line that has since been tattooed onto thousands of bodies worldwide and quoted in academic papers on media theory and posthumanism. Philosopher Jean Baudrillard's work on simulacra aligns so closely with Videodrome's themes that film scholars teach them together. Critics initially dismissed it as pretentious and incomprehensible. Today, it is studied in university film courses globally. When streaming culture exploded and audiences became more aware of their relationship to screens, Videodrome stopped feeling like science fiction and started feeling like a warning. A film that nobody watched at release is now a film that explains exactly how everyone lives. Number 5. Society, 1989. Society sat on a shelf for 3 years after it was completed. Its director, Brian Yuzna, had produced Reanimator and had credibility in the horror community, but no American distributor would touch this film. It finally received a limited release abroad, played midnight festivals, and then vanished almost entirely from mainstream awareness for years. Given what the film actually contains, the studio fear is completely understandable and entirely wrong. On the surface, society follows a Beverly Hills teenager who begins to suspect that his wealthy, glamorous family and social circle are literally not human. Beneath that surface, it is one of the most savage class satires ever produced in the horror genre. The rich in this film do not merely exploit the poor, they physically consume them. And the film ends with a sequence called The Shunting, a body horror climax so extraordinarily grotesque and inventive that special effects artist Screaming Mad George created techniques that had never been used before. When society finally found its audience through VHS circulation and cult festival screenings in the 1990s, horror fans were stunned that something this wickedly intelligent had been hidden from them. The class commentary is not subtle. It is operatic, feverish, and entirely intentional. In an era when wealth disparity has become a central cultural conversation, society reads less like horror fantasy and more like brutal social observation. Films like Parasite and Get Out drew critical comparisons to society upon release. Yuzna's ignored, shelved, rejected film had essentially blueprinted an entire subgenre of class horror decades before that term existed. Number 4. Jacob's Ladder, 1990. Jacob's Ladder opened against strong competition, received deeply divided reviews, and faded from theaters quietly. Most audiences in 1990 processed it as a confusing Vietnam trauma film with supernatural elements and moved on. Critics were uncertain whether to call it horror, drama, or psychological thriller. That categorical confusion killed it commercially. TriStar Pictures had a genuine creative anomaly on their hands and did not know how to sell it. Tim Robbins plays a Vietnam veteran in New York City who begins experiencing terrifying visions, demonic figures, violent hallucinations, a reality that keeps shifting beneath him. Director Adrian Lyne and screenwriter Bruce Joel Rubin had embedded within the film a structural secret that completely recontextualizes every scene, a device that audiences today immediately recognize from countless films that copied it. The Shyamalan twist, the unreliable narrator reveal, the dead man who does not know he is dead. Jacob's Ladder did all of this before any of those films made it a genre convention. When The Sixth Sense became a cultural phenomenon in 1999, film critics began looking backward and realized that Jacob's Ladder had explored identical thematic territory 9 years earlier with arguably more psychological depth. The film's visual language, demons with vibrating heads, corrupted domestic spaces, the thin membrane between the living world and whatever lies beyond, directly influenced Silent Hill, which was itself one of the most influential horror video games ever created. Jacob's Ladder did not just gain a cult following, it quietly rewired the DNA of an entire medium and got almost no credit for it at the time. Number 3. Nightbreed, 1990. The studio interference inflicted on Nightbreed is genuinely one of Hollywood's great horror stories, and not the good kind. Clive Barker, fresh off the extraordinary success of Hellraiser, had written and directed a film built on a genuinely radical concept. What if the monsters were the heroes? What if the creatures of the night were a persecuted community, and humanity was the true source of violence and destruction? Morgan Creek Productions panicked, recut the film without Barker's involvement, and then marketed it as a slasher movie, which it fundamentally is not. Audiences expecting conventional horror found something mythological, strange, and emotionally overwhelming. They were confused and disappointed because the marketing had lied to them. The film bombed, and Barker was publicly humiliated by the process. But the creatures of Midian, the underground city of the Nightbreed, had embedded themselves in the imaginations of everyone who saw the film, regardless of the studio's sabotage. Fan communities spent years campaigning for a director's cut. When the Cabal cut was finally screened publicly in 2012, after decades of searching for lost footage, the crowd response at Fantastic Fest was reportedly overwhelming. The restored version revealed what Barker had actually made, a sprawling, deeply compassionate monster mythology with genuine emotional resonance. Nightbreed is now discussed as a foundational text in queer horror theory, given how explicitly the Nightbreed function as an ostracized community hunted for being different. What the studio destroyed, the fans rebuilt. The legend is, in many ways, more powerful for having survived the wreckage. Number 2. Ginger Snaps. 2000. Ginger Snaps was completed just before the Columbine shooting and was subsequently considered unreleasable by distributors who feared any film centered on alienated teenagers and violence. It received an extremely limited Canadian theatrical release, was largely ignored internationally, and had almost no marketing budget. For a film that would go on to reshape feminist horror for an entire generation, its entry into the world was remarkably quiet and painful. The film uses werewolf transformation as a direct, unflinching metaphor for adolescent womanhood, specifically for the way female bodies are simultaneously celebrated, feared, policed, and punished by the culture around them. Ginger, a teenage girl who is bitten by a werewolf, does not simply become a monster. She becomes powerful, desired, dangerous, and ultimately uncontainable. Her transformation is inseparable from puberty, from the male gaze, from suburban suffocation. What is extraordinary is how emotionally precise the film is beneath the genre mechanics. The relationship between Ginger and her younger sister Brigitte is written and performed with a depth that most prestige dramas never achieve. Catherine Isabelle and Emily Perkins delivered performances that should have been career-defining immediately. Instead, they built that recognition slowly through word of mouth and festival screenings, when feminist film criticism began gaining mainstream traction in the 2000s. Ginger Snaps was suddenly everywhere, cited by critics, filmmakers, and scholars as the film that had already done what everyone was now demanding. Jennifer's Body drew direct comparisons. Raw, the French horror film, openly acknowledged its influence. Ginger Snaps waited patiently for the culture to catch up, and then it owned the conversation entirely. Number 1. Pontypool, 2008. Pontypool is the most ingenious horror film most people have never seen, and the fact that it received almost no theatrical distribution outside Canada remains one of the genuine injustices of modern horror cinema. Director Bruce MacDonald and writer Tony Burgess, who adapted his own novel, made a film set almost entirely inside a radio station in a small Ontario town, where a morning DJ begins receiving increasingly fragmented and horrifying reports of violence spreading through the community outside. The audience, like the characters, never sees what is happening directly. The horror is entirely constructed through language. And that is not a limitation. That is the film's radical, terrifying thesis. The infection in Pontypool is transmitted through the English language itself, through specific words that, once understood, corrupt the mind of the listener. Communication becomes contagion. Meaning becomes a weapon. In a media environment where language is weaponized daily, where misinformation spreads virally and rhetoric reshapes reality, Pontypool is not just a horror film. It is a prophecy delivered in the format of late-night radio. Stephen McHattie's performance as the gravel-voiced DJ Grant Mazzy is a masterclass in doing everything with almost nothing. Confined largely to a single room, he holds the entire film on his presence alone. Critics who saw it at Sundance were genuinely stunned. Distribution simply never materialized at the scale the film deserved. Pontypool has since accumulated a ferocious cult following. Horror scholars cite it regularly. In the age of social media and viral disinformation, it is regularly described as the most relevant horror film of the 21st century so far. The film that nobody distributed is now the film that everyone who loves horror tells everyone they know. That is not a cult following. That is a correction. Every single film on this list was rejected, buried, banned, or ignored. And every single one of them survived anyway. That should tell you something about what actually lasts in cinema. Drop your most controversial pick in the comments. Which film on this list deserved the most success at release? And here is the real question worth debating. If these films had been massive hits on opening weekend, would they even have become legends? Or does the struggle, the rejection, the underground journey make the myth?